I'm Troy McClure. You might remember Shesez from such YouTube videos as Good Golly, Low Poly, and Sakurai's Laugh is Creepy. I'm here to tell you about an exciting 106th episode of an ongoing series where a video game's camera is not quite what it seems. And when taken well outside its intended boundaries, a lot of questions are raised. That's why Shesez and one of Simpsons Hit and Run's lead programmers, Carrie Brisebois, is here to explain everything your non-programmer brain is willing to comprehend. Also, if you thought bringing beloved characters back to life was an easy ask, you've got some nerve. Be sure to take a look at the video description for the animator Daniel Flynn and voice work Brock Baker. But with that said, let's get going!
Alright, so what should we start with first? I feel like the Simpsons house is probably the best place to start with since that's where you start the whole game, but football in the groin has a football in the groin. Alright, tempting, but we will get back to that. So in this scene, as we start to pan the camera back, you're going to notice that the HUD is starting to go with it. And one of the things you couldn't see at first was two black bars on the top and bottom. Those two black bars are cinematic bars that are used when you talk to certain characters, which gives it a little bit of that cinematic vibe. But anyways, as we start to go inside of the house, you're going to notice something kind of strange. The first being it's relatively empty, of course, but on the ceiling, you'll notice that there's a unique texture. This is the same texture used for all the wood frames, only stretched out. It's just incredibly unusual because it's fully modeled and it's not the roof texture. The roof texture is something completely different. Also, you might notice that little red box, and that's something that is intentional. I just want to show that off real quick. That is the unloaded area of Bart's room. And the last thing I want to show you before we move on to football in the groin is not the zoom out of Springfield exactly. You might have already started to notice something else, and that's in the bottom right-hand corner. The way the minimap works is that it's a 3D object in its own space. And although there's a HUD graphic that we've long since abandoned, the track of the map itself is all one large object. And if you were to pan the camera out, the camera inside the little mini-map area pans with it and can show you the entire map in one little shot. Alright, now seriously, let's talk about Hans Mole Man. So when you walk over to a certain position inside of the Quickie Mart, it triggers a scene in which Hans Mole Man is pegged by the football. But as long as you don't step into that trigger, the football has to be stored somewhere. And where it happens to be is far below the Quickie Mart. And since now we know where the football is, I can show you the exact moment in which the football has its coordinates changed. And of course begins to play out this tender moment. And also, footballs are not the only thing that are stored outside the boundaries. Sometimes you're going to find characters. Like over here inside of the Simpsons house, if we take the camera out, first of all, you can see that the house room is stored inside the overworld map, which is really cool. But what's more perplexing is that you can find a model of Lisa and Apu stored outside here, and only when you go outside the house during this mission. So hold up for a second here. If we go inside the game's credits, we can see that the credits actually exist in a 3D space. And so by taking the camera anywhere we want, we can take it straight over to the lead programmer section, which is where we're going to find Carrie. And since Carrie was available and gracious enough to answer some of these questions, my first one goes out to this one. What's up with these characters?
So Lisa and Apu are there. I think it's because the mission prior to this one, you actually drove by them and I think you spoke to Apu. And so they're actually still in memory and they won't get dumped until we need the space. So I think when you go outside and talk to Flanders, I think one of them or probably both of them will be dumped out of memory. And that's why they're still there. We had very little memory on these devices, so we had to do as much sort of caching and containering as possible.
Alright, so the starting menu is really interesting. There's a ton of stuff to show off here. The first of which are the cameo characters that stop by the window, and this is what it looks like when we take the camera outside. The characters are randomly loaded in, and when their animation's through, they're in a frozen position off camera until the next character is loaded in. I should also throw in the fact real quick that pretty much any case where a character does a quick little bit and then walks off screen, it looks just like that. Only since no other characters come into play, the characters in those scenes remain there indefinitely until you reload the room. Also, the racing car on the little racing track has various logos from companies from The Simpsons. And so by slowing down the footage to 10% of its original speed, it's very easy to get a much better look at it. And in case you didn't know, this is a vehicle that you can unlock in the game. It's just scaled down on this little track here. And although both portraits are used in the game, you never get to see these two portraits side by side. And in the title menu, you can see that the Simpsons Den has a family portrait that is line art, as opposed to the portrait in the living room, which is 3D models. Now, there are two mysterious things of interest to note in this scene. One is the black circle that follows your camera around no matter where you go. Now, it should be noted that I figured out what this is. It's that black circle that's a transitional effect in cartoons and video games and stuff. And it is used in Simpsons Hit and Run, just not in the main menu. While the other, of course, is the picture of George H.W. Bush's house in texture form through the window. Now here's the thing, that's totally fine and normal. We see that a lot in Boundary Break, where pictures are used to trick the player into thinking that there may be more 3D geometry right there in the scene. But what's really odd here is that behind that picture is another picture that is much larger and much more out of place. It's a blue sky with a pink landscape. So naturally, I had to ask Harry what was up with these two things.
So that black ring is actually for the wipe aperture effect trick. So whenever you go inside or outside of a building, we do that. You'll see it like a black whoop whoop kind of wipe in and out to hide the loading and stuff. Originally, we want to do more effects like star wipes and stuff like that because it's like a reference to Homer Simpson getting the video editing kit. But we ended up just sticking with the one. So you're seeing the rig there that's following you around, ready to wipe at any time. The pink and blue mountain background behind the picture of George H.W. Bush's house outside the window, it looks like it's just leftover art from when we were setting up the interior originally. I think that what happened was the artists were setting up the interior and they wanted to have stuff outside the window, and then we realized that we should probably put something more interesting like George H.W. Bush's house. So that's that. It's just leftover art.
So this next segment I'm going to call the Mr. Burns segment, because everything is going to be related to him in some way. And the first that I find especially charming is this pipe over here when you fall into one of Mr. Burns' traps. Now, veteran fans may have noticed that the pipe doesn't exist when it's not shooting Homer out of it, which begs the question, where does it go? And yeah, this is great. So what happens is the pipe is supposed to rise up like it's supposed to be seen by the player, and then rushes over to the back of this area, so far back, in fact, that you're not allowed to see it when you're looking at the building from the outside. And that is the point. This pipe is not really meant to be seen in full. It's not fully modeled in any sort of way. And the devs needed it to be stored so that when the player falls through the traps again, it can be called to that spot once more. So the solution wasn't to warp it to this other position, but instead make the velocity of the pipe really fast so they can get right back into that spot. Also, this was a huge viewer request, and I'm starting to see why. I think this was already documented somewhere, but you can get back into the Mr. Burns mansion in the very first chapter of the game. In fact, you don't even need any special tools or software to do this. You can use one of the in-game cheats to wiggle your way into the mansion, but as you're going to see here, it's completely unfurnished, which makes the effort pretty pointless. And also, inside the power plant is the power plant employees that are inside the radiation suits. So what I wanted to do was to see if there was any modeled heads inside of these suits, and as you're going to see here, the face was rendered just about enough to only show you what could be seen through the mask. There is a little bit outside of those edges, but not quite enough to make a full face. So here's another great little mystery that I found here. It's with every light switch in the game. Now, The Simpsons Hit and Run has a lot of gags where if you push a doorbell, one of the characters will actually interact with you, but you won't be able to see them. And so this is how I had the inspiration to look behind any wall that had a doorbell. But in doing so, I noticed that there are two things about this doorbell that the player's not supposed to see. One is that there's a texture of steel beams on the opposite side of every single button, and inside of every single button is a green try. And all this just seemed a little bit unusual to me. So, Mr. Brisebois, if you don't mind enlightening us just a little bit here.
So that switch that you see all over the world, it's like a doorbell. It has like a thing behind it, like a piece of steel. And I think the reason for that is because we originally, when we were building the out-of-car gameplay, we were doing a lot of that in the power plant, because the nuclear power plant has sort of the most interesting puzzle for jumping around in. And that button, I think, was used at one point to make the moving platforms move around. So I think what happened was we needed to have more places in the world for interaction. And we wanted to have like a consistent mechanism for the players to understand that, well, they got to click this. And we ended up using that. There's like a blue effect on doors and on buttons and stuff that kind of pulses to say, hey, come touch this thing. But that switch also ended up being used as part of it because it was all kind of like one thing that the artist can put all over the place and was consistent. So that's why that switch is all over the place. And the reason why it still has a bit of steel is I think when they were building it, it was to look like it belonged in the nuclear power plant. But once they sunk it into a wall, then you couldn't really tell the difference. So it just got used everywhere.
The next two things are really exciting. They are unused art assets. The first one you're going to be looking at is a partially used art asset. There's a scene inside the Quickie Mart in which Krusty is looking at a magazine, and on the front of the magazine you can see the headshots of Scully from the X-Files episode, as well as Homer's brief co-worker Mindy. However, there's clearly a full-page spread that drops from the magazine that only shows you partially of what's going on. And very fortunately, if you take the camera around to see what it looks like on the other side, that image is displayed in full. And what it appears to be is a poorly drawn picture of Mindy, and for whatever reason her arms are extended outwards, and so in order to fit the page spread, they squish her arms. It's really unusual, and I love it. But that's not even the last of it. If you look at the Stonecutter Tunnel, you might remember that there's some paintings and portraits that are parodies of other real-life art. And not too far off from that tunnel, on the other side of Mr. Burns' mansion, you can find some unused art assets. This is entirely unused in the game, and it appears to be a parody of the famous painting American Gothic. Here's a couple of loose ends I wanted to share with you guys that I thought were kind of interesting but didn't really lump into a category. The first one is exploring the elementary school. Of course, when the camera is fixed, a lot of players want to know what it looks like if you explore in some of the rooms and stuff or go down the hallway. And here to show you that the developers were very, very efficient with what you couldn't see. And so, for example, inside of this classroom, you'll notice that there's no walls and that there's actually a missing desk. That's just because you would never be able to see it. It's a waste of resources. And in the same school, I'll show you a character interaction. This is with Smithers and Mr. Burns. Like I mentioned before, they are frozen in place until you activate the scene, and then they are frozen on the other side of wherever they leave. This area that is featured in one of the later maps has a log that comes out of one building and then is supposedly shredded up in the other building. And it's fun to show off here that this is just one log reused over and over again, because once that log goes into the building on the right, it immediately gets warped over into the building on the left to be reused once again. Also, this is kind of a rare opportunity. We can see what it looks like when a game is loading. In the Simpsons Hit and Run, they put a HUD over the screen to hide what's going on while the game loads. However, if we move the camera, we can see exactly what's happening to the game in real time. In the chapter with Apu, there's a scene where you have to chase down babies for diapers, and although there are lots of great low poly models in this game, this one in particular was fun to show off. So here's what the babies look like inside of the sedan. It's fantastic. Their eyeballs are literally squares. And this was a highly upvoted viewer request. As always, you can follow me on Twitter whenever I announce a game. Throw suggestions at me. It oftentimes steers a lot of the content for the show, so if you want to see your suggestions show up on the show, make sure you give me a follow and wait for the tweet. You know, with that said, there's nothing really to be shown inside of this spaceship. Unfortunately, everything that you see inside here is just a texture in reverse. It's pretty much inside out. Also, for whatever reason, there are multiple cases of the Springfield prison underneath the map. You can find one here, and you can find one all the way over here as well. Also, when you decide to buy a car in the game, or a costume, you'll obviously notice this showcase room, and this showcase room is just attached to the front of the camera, while the in-game world is still existing outside of it. Okay, this is pretty much the grand finale. The whole thing starts to get a little bit out of control here. So the first thing you're going to notice is that these boats have weird textures underneath their ceilings, which is very unusual, but then underneath the water, there is also geometry that seems to be unused, and it looks like it was meant to be part of the ground, but I can't say for sure. Back up above the water, it's easy to notice a boat with the color pink inside of it. I only managed to catch this one initially because if you move at a certain angle, only half of the boat was culled out, thus showing the pink innards. And right next to the Squidport sign, underneath the ground, is a cube with different textures on each side. Naturally, I had to take this clip and send this over to Carrie so he can explain it all. And I guarantee you're going to love all of these explanations, especially the last one. So, enjoy.
So, when you see areas in the world like that where there's a strange texture, it's probably because the artists were just going very quickly. This level in particular, I think it was one of the last levels that we made, And we were under an extreme time pressure to get this game done for Vivendi because they had a particular ship date that we had to hit. So we were crunching really hard. And so you can see, the artists were taking as many shortcuts as they could. There's even those magenta, bright pink ones, and those are materials that were set up that didn't actually have a texture. So that's actually an error texture that you're seeing, telling the artist that they're supposed to replace it. But because the actual in-game camera never really saw either the underside of the boat or the pink ones off in the distance, they never really got flagged as a problem, so they were just left. A lot of the time, artists have to take like extreme shortcuts to get things done quickly. The underground geometry is interesting too, and I think it's also related to extreme crunch time, because what can happen is when the artists are working in Maya, in order to do an export for the art to put into the world, they would select things, and sometimes when they're doing a select, they might grab extra stuff and put it in, and then we might not notice it till it's too late. So I think those bits of geometry and the blue circles and all those other things that are sort of underground in the scene are because they were just accidentally left in when the artists were doing an export that we never noticed because we were so busy trying to make the game. The last thing is that cube that's underground. So that cube that's underground is interesting. If I recall, I think what we were trying to do was put a bunch of those around this level and start making references to two things. We wanted to do the three-eyed fish to show that there's strange things in the water going on, but we also wanted to do references to chuds. So the chuds were related to an episode where Homer was talking about having gone to New York City, and he was upset because of pimps and chuds. So we wanted to put chuds in, but I think we were not allowed to by Fox for various reasons. So I think that was art that we were preparing to do something with, other fish or chuds that we never got to actually do, which I think would have been a funny gag.
So the only thing I want to get out to you guys real quick is that we made it. You guys gave enough votes so that I can go to the Shorty Awards and be nominated for Video Game Channel of the Year, which is incredible. And thank you guys so much for that. And when it gets closer to that date, I'll give you more details. But for now, I decided I wanted to give the floor to Carrie Brisebois. The man did take years of his life to make this game world come to life. And I feel like game developers don't get the opportunity as often as they should to speak to their fans. So with that said, sir, take it away. Thank you.
I'm always surprised at how many people remember this game, and in particular how many people say that they grew up on it. So, for me, growing up on a game was like growing up on a Nintendo game or something old where the platforms were really just sort of getting started out. And to hear people say that the Simpsons Hit and Run was a formative game for them really means a lot to me. So I'd like to shout out to all the fans who are really into the game and say how much I appreciate it every time I hear that somebody was really into it. The other thing I'd like to do is to say how incredible I think that the Donut team is. They've been working on this 15-year-old game, modding it and adding content to it and making it even better than it was originally. And they've done some really incredible stuff with the tools and stuff that they've made for it. So I think that they deserve a lot of people's recognition, and people should go check it out. Thanks a lot for your time.
Just keeping a promise here. Thank you to Carrie's children for vouching for my show. You guys are the true heroes, and I hope that you enjoyed this episode, and hope you know that your dad is a really cool dude.